Hi all, we've made it up to chapters 9 and 10, decision making and problem solving. And this is kind of where the rubber hits the road. And you're going to be going through a process of problem solving and decision making in this project. And so here we go. We will define problem solving and decision making. And I could juxtapose those two terms because problem solving comes before decision making, but to separate them like that's kind of a false separation. They're kind of obviously linked as processes. I'll talk a little bit about differences between groups and individuals solving problems and making decisions. Talk about the importance of structure. A little bit about what's necessary in these processes, including critical thinking and reasoning. We'll also talk about what can go wrong. So just as well that things can go great with group work, things can go wrong too. There's two sides of it. And then we'll end with some practical tips, which are basically decision-making processes. And when we come to that, you can use one of those in your group, or you can use a simpler method to make your decisions, or you can come up, if you've come up with something on your own, you can go with that. So a problem is a discrepancy between the current state, what actually is happening, and a desired goal, what should be happening. Problem solving is the comprehensive multi-step procedure a group uses to move from its current state, which is unsatisfactory in some way, to the desired goal. It involves creating and discovering solutions, evaluating them, choosing among them, and putting them into effect. So as you're doing this for your group project, there's a task force for the college doing exactly this. And so I don't have insight on that, but I have heard that this group, this task force / committee, is coming up with multiple options, and then they're going to choose from the best one. And that's true of all colleges and universities across the country and the world. Really, they're not just going to come up with one or two solutions and go with it. They're gonna evaluate as many as they can. Groups can be much better problem solvers and decision makers than individuals. At their best, groups achieve what's called an assembly effect, in which the decision is qualitative and quantitatively better than the best individual judgment or any one member, or the average judgments of all the members. Basically, that groups can make better decisions than people individually. This results in what's called synergy, when the group is really functioning at its most optimal state. So much can come out of that. So there's the assembly effect. There's also something called non-summativity, I think, which might have come up earlier in the semester, which means that groups can be more than the sums of their parts. Go ahead and look more closely at this slide. It talks about some of the advantages and disadvantages of group work. For example, you can compensate for each other's weaknesses. You can spot each other's errors. You can offer many more perspectives. You can get more done. And here I am reading it anyhow. And when a group comes to a decision, it increases that acceptance of the decision when everybody's been part of the decision, as opposed to one person kind of dictating what's going to happen. Structure is important, and what you have here is something called the functional perspective. And without structure, solving the problem and making the decision can be haphazard. So here are some fundamental requirements. Groups must understand the issue to be resolved. They must kind of determine what the minimal characteristics of an acceptable choice is, and they must be able to determine what's relevant and realistic. They must carefully consider and choose those alternatives, and then ultimately they must select the best alternative. A lot of this decision making is, we're not clairvoyant. We can't predict the future, so a lot of it's guesswork, and you kind of have to go with your best educated, informed guess going forward. Here are some, these are some of the simplest ways to make decisions, and I think that this came up in COM 101, but there's 4 different ways that you can make a decision. A leader can make it. So go ahead and look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. The leader can just make that decision by himself or herself alone. He or she can consult with the group. That's another way, and then make the decision. Or you can just do it by vote. You can, so for your group of 6 people, by majority vote would have to be 4 people. 3 against 3 wouldn't count. Or kind of a more difficult and more less achievable way is consensus, where it's unanimous, everybody supports it. If that happens, then everybody's bought into it, so everybody's going to be engaged and invested in the project and the decision. However, that can be very difficult, even with a group as small as 4 or 5 or 6, to get everybody to agree completely. There's something called the Fisher's model, which is just a progression, how group work and decisions are made. First, you have to orient yourselves. Then at some point, conflict is going to arise from the interaction, but from that conflict, if it's handled properly, a decision will emerge, and then over time, through agreement and discussion, that decision will be reinforced. Throughout the process, you want to make sure that you're thinking critically about every step and every smaller decision that you make along the process of making the big decision. One is, it's always safer to bank on what are called facts versus inferences. Inferences are conclusions that are based on facts, so they're kind of one step removed from a fact. It's kind of a guess based on a fact. So just realize that if you're basing something on an inference, a conclusion based on a fact, it's not a fact itself. It's a guess. And obviously some inferences are better than others. Data is important. Rely on scientific data to make your decisions. And I could put rely more on data than your personal opinions. It's okay. We all have our own opinions. Opinions are inferences. Data is more scientific, factual information. Always consider the sources that you're using for your decisions. I've jumped down below to the last word of the internet. If you're basing your decisions on information that you've gotten from the internet, you have to really evaluate the source to determine how credible and valuable the information is. And then what are called fallacies. Fallacies are errors of reasoning which, unfortunately, and you saw this in 101, COM 101, when we talked about public speaking, they're arguments that are very effective, but really kind of distort reality. One fallacy is what's called a false dichotomy. When you present a solution to a particular problem and you present two solutions, one solution is much more favorable and the other solution is much more unfavorable. So when presented with that choice, most people are going to pick the more favorable choice, of course, but the fallacy resides in the fact that there's always more than one solution, or two solutions, I should say, or more than two ways of looking at any situation or problem. So we see a lot of that. That's kind of called binary thinking too. Just kind of, it's an either or proposition. And it's easier to think in those terms, right? Either or, black and white, but that's not the real world. The real world is much more shades of gray and more options. So shy away from anything. Go ahead, look at the text or look up fallacies. You'll see that there are hundreds of different kinds of fallacies. We especially see more of these days with the internet. They're all out there. What can go wrong when groups are solving problems and making decisions? One is polarization, of course. They can, group members can just get farther and farther apart on their positions. That can be very difficult to overcome. And then the opposite of that is groupthink, where the group tends to agree on everything a little too easily without any kind of dissent or questioning. That's not good either. You want a healthy mix of agreement and disagreement when you're going through this process. If you have too much disagreement, obviously that can stop things, but if you have too much agreement on everything, your outcome is not going to be as good as it can be. The last 3 slides here are just different practical problem-solving techniques that the text offers. You can use these if you'd like in your project, or as you saw, some of the decision-making processes that were offered before by the leader, by vote, you can use those. Here we are kind of, again, separating the two. These are more about the problem solving, figuring out the problem, as opposed to the decision making. So we have what's called the PMOPS technique. We have something that's called single question format technique. And then finally, we have what's called the ideal solution format. This might be the easiest one. Step 1, identify the nature of the problem. Does everyone agree on the nature of the problem? Step 2, identify the ideal solution. What would be the ideal solution from the point of view of all interested people or groups involved? Step 3, identify the conditions that must change. Which conditions within the situation could be changed to achieve an ideal solution? And step 4, select the most ideal solution. Of all the solutions available, which one best approximates the ideal solution? So for you, we know that we're not going to go back to exactly how it was last year and the previous years at Albion College. It's going to be different, but everybody would like it to. So we want to try to get as close as we can to an in-person residential campus, knowing that that's not likely. How can we get close to that? So I'm kind of giving up a little bit of what you should consider in this project. And there it is for problem solving and decision making. Good luck and keep me posted with your progress.